Hello, everyone, on behalf of Artscapades. I'm Maria Bell Salter, and thank you for joining us for this first event of our summer program, our talk by Brad Rosenstein on Noel Coward, Art and Style. For those who might be with us for the first time, Artscapades was set up to help support the arts by presenting expert speakers, offering events which aim to be enjoyable, educational, and profitable, so that we can help to raise much needed funding for our UK museums and galleries. So thank you very sincerely to everyone buying tickets to this and to our other online events. We are thrilled to have you and very grateful for your support. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Brad Rosenstein, who will be telling us about Noel Coward, Art and Style, and he's coming to us live from San Francisco. Brad is an independent curator, speaker, and writer. For 10 years, he was the curator of exhibitions and programs at San Francisco's Museum of Performance and Design, where he organized more than 60 exhibitions on performing arts subjects. His exhibition, Star Quality, The World of Noel Coward at New York's Lincoln Center, was the most highly attended in the center's history, following successful runs in San Francisco and Los Angeles. He recently curated the Noel Coward Room in London, as well as the current exhibition, Noel Coward, Art and Style, which opened this week at the Guildhall Art Gallery. Brad's presentation will last a bit under an hour, after which he has kindly agreed to take questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask any questions, please just type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will pass them on to Brad afterwards. So now it's time to hand over to you, Brad, and we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's such a pleasure to be here. Artscapades is a wonderful program, and especially as our exhibition is being offered to the public free of charge, it's a wonderful boon to every museum that engages in that kind of activity. So I'm very pleased to be part of this program. So I'm going to set up to share my screen, and hopefully the tech gods are with us and you'll see everything beautifully. So hopefully that's showing up for you now. But let me tell you a little bit about the genesis of this exhibition. Following on the success of the Noel Coward exhibition in the US, we had really hoped that we might be able to do a London incarnation, but it just turned out there really wasn't an appropriate venue at the time. But recently becoming aware of the wonderful gallery at the Guildhall, which is also dedicated in part to the history of the City of London, it just seemed like a really wonderful match for us. And we were really delighted to engage with the Guildhall, who have been absolutely wonderful partners. And it's a beautiful facility if you haven't visited, right in the heart of the city. And it also got us thinking, because it is an art gallery that we really wanted to be thinking visually. And this fit hand in glove with something that I've been talking about for a long time. In all of the incarnations of the Noel Coward exhibition, I mean, obviously what we revere most about Coward these days is his verbal wit in his writings, in his songs. And that's what he's known for, and of course that's what we were celebrating in our exhibition. But I was so struck in looking. There's some wonderful production photos, as you'll see, from many of his premiere productions, which he often also directed in addition to writing and starring in. That he had just an incredible visual sense. And as I started digging into it, I started realizing that for his contemporary audiences at the time, the visual side of his work was as important as the verbal side. They came expecting a feast of both, because they knew from the very start of his career, he was working with the finest artists, the couturiers, designers, and the visual element of his shows would be extremely important, as much as the dialogue and the music. And so I really felt, especially because we were doing this in an art gallery, it was really time to make that focus. And so Noel Coward, Art and Style was born. This show was originally supposed to open almost a year ago. And in 2020, it would have been celebrating the centenary of Noel's West End debut as a playwright in 1920 with his play called I'll Leave It to You. He was just 20 years old at the time. The show was very well received. It didn't run very long, but it certainly kind of put him on the map. But it was with some of his slightly later productions that he really started to arrive after that. So, you know, whatever time we're celebrating Noel Coward in is the right time. And of course, you know, we had to deal with 3 pandemic postponements in the course of doing this, but we're thrilled to be able to finally throw the doors open on Monday. And the show will be running until December 23rd. So you'll have plenty of time to see it. And I hope you'll make the trek. So anyway, Noel Coward, Art and Style. The vision that many people have for Noel, oh, looks like I'm stuck. Let's see if I can advance this. I think I'm going to have to start this again. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. So the vision that many people have of Noel is of the very sophisticated playboy in the silk dressing gown with a cigarette and a cocktail and a witty remark. And that was an image that he very, very carefully crafted for himself. It was very intentional, and it was a huge hit. And he played variations of that over the course of his 6-decade career. Quite engagingly and intelligently, he evolved over time to match his contemporary audiences. But in a way, he made it a bit too successful, that image, and it's become the stereotype that's kind of stuck with him. And so we wanted to kind of address that off the bat in the show, but also certainly not make it what the show is about. And so we start off, when you walk into the exhibition, the first thing you're greeted by is one of Noel's original dressing gowns that he owned and wore. We wanted him in a way to be greeting you and welcoming you in with that image. But the show, that's just the starting point for what the show is about. But this really became his trademark, the silk dressing gown. And he said they were wonderful to act in. He said they have swing. It gave a wonderful animation to him and a line to find on the stage. So he was very aware of that as an actor. But it also, in a way, also became a bit of a prison for him. And it was something that he wanted to break out of. And as you'll see, he did in many, many ways. So the show is broken down into 4 sections, and their titles are each drawn from Noel's writings and work. And the first section is called London Calling, after his first big review that he did for André Charlot in 1923, which was really his first big breakthrough. He wrote many of the songs and sketches that were included in the review. He also performed in it. He was also given incredible latitude over the staging of the show, which is something that would take on a bigger part of his role. And what was really important about it is that it became not only his breakthrough, but it was also his first time really collaborating with some of the great artists and couturiers at this time. Design was a very important part of the musical reviews, which were evenings that we don't really have a parallel for anymore, but collections of satirical songs and sketches, big production numbers, and could sometimes go in some very dark spaces as well, as we'll see. But he came from a very different world, and coming into this magical world of the West End in London was really transformative for him. That's the Marquis from On With the Dance, his first review with the great impresario Charles Cochrane. It was the first time that his name was up in lights, and it was a very significant moment for him because he'd actually started his career very early on as a boy actor. In the theater of his day, especially in the Edwardian period in which he was first growing up in, there was a great call for child actors in London theater, certainly for the Christmas pantomimes every year, but all the time. Plays usually had much, much bigger casts. They were often family dramas in which there were roles for children. So there was a big need for child actors at the time. Noel came from what he called genteel poverty in the London suburbs. He was born in Teddington. As far as you could possibly imagine from the world of cocktails and dressing gowns. People are often shocked by that because he was so successful at conveying this upper crust image that they think he was born into that. He wasn't. He had none of that background. He had no aristocratic or high money connections. He didn't go to university. He barely had any schooling. He was mostly self-taught and came from this very nearly impoverished family. His mother, Violet, was the real head of the household, and she kept the family afloat by running a series of boarding houses, which Noel was fascinated by. He loved the people who came in and out and who were at dinner every night. It really sparked his imagination early on. But it really became a matter of him also having to help earn a living for the family. And when she saw an ad for child actors for a play that was being done in London, she had him audition and he got a role. And he made his professional debut at age 11 on the West End stage as a boy actor. And this photo is from one of his early performances. It's him at age 11 on the left, with the great actor-manager Charles Hawtrey. And Hawtrey had a tremendous effect on Coward. You know, we use this word style in the exhibition in many different senses, not just the visual. And Hawtrey's style was revolutionary for the time. He was really lowering the temperature on the big, grand Victorian acting of his time, and really specialized in a kind of comedic underplaying and understatement. It was also a really brilliant director. And this affected Noel for the rest of his life. He really would, he said he always used to, whenever he ran into trouble as a director in later years, he would always say, how would the governor have done it? How would Hawtrey do this? It was a tremendous influence on him, but also in his style of acting, which was about understatement, very important part of his work. What was he seeing at this time? It was amazing, given the family's financial position, that they were able to go to theater quite extensively. But his mother really loved it. She had been a fan of theater all her life, and she took Noel constantly to see what was being done. And I think a part of his history that's not acknowledged, I think, nearly enough was the enormous effect that Edwardian musical comedy and operetta had on him. Which he was seeing a lot of in those days. It was the primary musical form. And this lady in particular, Lily Elsie, was one of the great stars at that period. And she broke through in the first British production of The Merry Widow, which Noel eventually saw, and was just absolutely blown away by that whole world. The stars of that time became his icons. And to the end of his life, he remembered these songs verbatim and would perform them. It had a huge effect on his own work, particularly his songwriting, but also the visual. And this is a costume design by Percy Alexander that was done for Lily Elsie in The Merry Widow. And you can see just the magic of these costumes, the effect it had on him. It was a really kind of enchanted theater world. And another show that we know he saw was a huge hit of the time, Chu Chin Chow, which was this kind of Orientalist fantasy musical. And these are costumes also by Percy that of chorus members for that show. And again, this had a huge impact on teenage Noel Coward, and he would remember this kind of showmanship and spectacle and magic, and would inform his own work very, very strongly. And what's interesting, we have a number of Noel's notebooks from throughout his life, which he started keeping in this period when he was a teenager. And this is his very first earliest surviving notebook from around 1914, 1916. And what's interesting is that most of what it's filled with is not writing. Most of what it's filled with is drawings. It's pen and ink and watercolor drawings, and they are a range of everything from people who he saw on the street to fashion plates to costumes that he'd seen in the theater or he imagined. It's really fascinating to see at this early age how visual he was, and really already understanding the role of costume to reveal or conceal character. You see the dramatist's eye in that, and also in the directorial eye of how costumes move and how they serve their wearer and what they indicate about the person wearing them. You can start to see all of that in these very early drawings of his. So this is a glimpse of the show installed, and what was also as important as what was on stage in those days was the audience too, and that beautiful cape that you see, and here's a more close-up view of it, is by the very famous fashion designer Lucille, who was one of the great, really probably the first great international British couturier of her time. And the audiences at these shows, particularly in the stalls, would dress to the nines, and it became as much a part of the show as what was on stage. And this too was part of the glamour of what Noel was growing up with, both from the audience side and as an actor on stage. This is what he was seeing. It was a really kind of magical world, especially for a poor boy from the suburbs. And he just at this time was starting to write. The woman standing there with him is Esme Wynne, who was really the first of a long line of very strong creative women who would play key roles in his life. They were incredibly close friends. She was a fellow actor. She was the one who really got him started with playwriting. With her own efforts. They had a kind of friendly competition. They collaborated on some early scripts. And he managed to get one of these early shows, and this is from I'll Leave It to You, that first West End show that he had in 1920, that really got him his start. And he was also acting in these shows. So he was also being that fashionable 1920s young man was also part of his image. at the time, got launched with that show. But he was still kind of in search, in a way, of his image, as you'll see. But his real breakthrough came with London Calling, this André Charlot review in 1923. And it really was the first thing to put him on the map. And it had an extraordinary impact in letting people know who this rising young man was. And this is from a number called Other Girls. And one of the other really significant things about this show was that all of the costumes were designed by the leading British couturier at the time, who was Edward Molyneux. And incidentally, that is how he pronounced his name. Many people call him Edward Molyneux because of its French spelling, but he always insisted it was a good English name. And he said people mispronounced his name for his entire career, but it is Molyneux. But he did all of the costumes for this review, which was an incredible coup for André Charlot, but he knew what a draw that would be for audiences to see these latest cutting edge fashions that were part of this review. And you can see he did a very clever design with this, with the chorus of this show, with these interlocking black and white patterns on their dresses, which could form and reform as they moved and regrouped on stage. And it really had a huge effect. This was his first time collaborating with Noel, and they would remain collaborators for the rest of Noel's career. Throughout all the way into the 1960s, Molyneux would often be dressing his leading ladies, at least, if not doing all the costumes for his shows. So it really started to wake Noel up to the power of staging and to the power of costume and sets and what they could do in a show. London Calling was also very significant because it was the first time he appeared as an adult with the great actress Gertrude Lawrence. And the two of them, even though they only appeared in a couple of shows together, 3 as adults, it became one of the most legendary partnerships in theatrical history. There was just a kineticism and an electricity between the two of them that was absolutely magical on stage. They really brought out the best in each other, and she was an astonishingly good actress and comedian, and they worked extremely well together. But this was their first time performing together as an adults, kind of setting the pattern for their future. And she also broke through in one of the songs in the review, Parisian Pierrot, which became one of Noel's first really great musical hits that also put him on the map. And there she is in her Molyneux costume, which was one of Noel's favorites, this beautiful kind of harlequinade number that was staged to that song. And there's Noel looking very un-Noel Coward-like. This is when he's still sort of finding his image on stage. But this was a number that he wrote called Russian Blues, which had been very much inspired by the Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, which had burst like a bombshell in the teens in London, and had a huge effect on arts and culture of its time, and was still very much active at that time. Diaghilev was still appearing frequently with his company in London in this period in the 20s, with his incredible designers like Leon Bakst and Picasso, and really just was a galvanic force in theater at that time. And this number was kind of inspired by that, as well as a gentle kind of sarcastic take on it as well. This first section of the exhibition, each section of the exhibition, we really wanted to orient around Noel's relationship to the stage, whether it was on stage, off stage, backstage. We really thought that was a valuable perspective to have. So this first section is very much about backstage, which is the very non-glamorous side of theater, where it's hard work and sweat that make the magic happen. But it was also just as equally a very magical place for Noel. It was his second home in performing in the theater. And he wrote a lovely poem late in his career called The Boy Actor that summons up the magic of the makeup table for a young boy, and what a transformative experience that was when he was preparing to go on stage. It was a very special place for Noel to prepare. Part of what made that magic happen was also some incredible producers. And he started out with André Charlot, who was one of the great impresarios of revues. But it was really with this man, Charles Cochrane, that really elevated Noel into the top echelon. Cochrane was really the Florence Ziegfeld of Britain of his time. He was the leading producer of everything, from straight plays. He promoted prize fights, he did musicals and operettas. But he was an incredibly astute man, a real sense of what an audience wanted and liked, but also very good taste. He was very instrumental in bringing in some of the great artists of his time, as Diaghilev had done, to design his sets and costumes. Really had an extraordinary theatrical sense and very practical also sense of how to get a show on. He taught Noel a lot. He wound up producing 9 of his plays in the late 20s and early 30s, really some of his very key productions at that time. Had an enormous influence on him. And Cochrane had an amazing eye for talent. This is Jessie Matthews, who he'd seen in the chorus of a Charlotte review, became one of his stars in his shows, and eventually became the reigning queen of British movie musicals in the 1930s. But he spotted lots and lots of talent, including Noel, who was just very much emerging at this time, but really gave him great prominence in his reviews. And the reviews could be, a range of things. He specialized, Cochrane, in the intimate review, as it was called, as opposed to the spectaculars of Ziegfeld. But his shows could still be quite spectacular. And this is one of the numbers in one of his great reviews, one of Noel's reviews, This Year of Grace. But as I say, he could spot talent very acutely. And in these ranks of what were known as Mr. Cochrane's young ladies, his chorus girls, many, many talents would arise. The young woman who's the third from the right here was then called Marjorie Robertson, but soon changed her name to Anna Neagle, and within just a few years became one of the great stars of British musical films. And she came up through the ranks of Cochrane's chorus line, just as Jessie Matthews had, who is now the leading lady. But the reviews could also go in some very dark and unexpected and eclectic places. And I was very, very pleased that we were able to assemble all the materials to tell a very complete story in one big vitrine of one of Noel's most significant numbers in his review, This Year of Grace. It was called Dance Little Lady. And it was really a very bleak look at the magical energy of the Roaring Twenties, which Noel always felt very ambivalent about it. He loved it. At the time of his life, he was the quintessential figure of that decade. But he also saw the downside. He saw people who got destroyed by things like drug addiction or alcoholism. He saw what could happen from this very fast, syncopated jazz age pace. And the song really addresses that in a very surreal way. He had seen the work of Oliver Messel, who went on to become one of the great stage designers of his time, but who started out as a painter and had exhibited some of his papier-mâché masks, which Noel was very struck by, as was Cochrane. And it was Noel's idea to ask him to do the masks and costumes for this number, which he thought would really add a wonderfully macabre, surreal touch, which it certainly did. And this is a page from Messel's scrapbooks showing his actually working on the masks for this number. And we were also able to get the original sketches for both the costumes and the masks for this, which is wonderful to be able to trace this from its inception all the way through to the finished product. And these are his mask designs. And Messel was capable of the most refined artistic style, and that's what he was more widely known for. But he goes in a very deliberately cartoonish direction with these masks. It really is in many ways prefiguring pop art of decades later, really making it look like a living cartoon on stage and evoking a very, very different kind of world than had ever been seen on stage up until that time, but perfectly appropriate to this number. And here's his original costume design for it too. And you can see he does these very bright but very deliberately off colors for the women's dresses. His notes also note that they should be constructed of giant sequins made of celluloid, so they would be provide this very kind of flashy but also almost over the top bizarre touch to their costumes. And likewise, the men's evening clothes, he specifies, should actually be made of sailcloth, which actually would have been very stiff and given them this very bizarre sheen. This was all very deliberate. He chose his materials with great care, and it really created this kind of otherworldly aspect to this number. And best of all, we were able to get, there are 2 of the surviving masks that are in the collection of the V&A to actually give people a sense of what these masks were really like, and the kind of haunting, macabre quality that they would have had on the performers. And then finally, we see the finished number on stage and in all its glory with these dancing couples that were kind of quintessentially 1920s, but also with a kind of haunted, empty feel to them. Sonny Hale, who actually sang the song as a kind of omniscient narrator, is there on the right. But this chorus line really starts to threaten. The little lady in the center is the dancer Laurie Devine, brilliant performer of that time. who really becomes increasingly menaced by this very bizarre, macabre chorus line of her time as the music gets faster and faster and faster and builds to this crescendo. And Noel said it absolutely brought down the house every night and was considered one of the great stagings of his career. Really set the tone, and obviously very different from what we stereotypically think of as a Coward experience on stage. And there was a lot of that in the early days. He had a much more varied career than people remember now, when so much the focus is on his drawing room comedies, which were just a part of his work at that time. But he worked, thanks to Cochrane, with a lot of great artists of his day. And this is Rex Whistler, designed a sketch that unfortunately we know very little about because it was cut from the review this year of Grace during the run in Manchester, the previews. And very little seems to be known about it, but we do have this original set design that he did for the piece. Is something I would love to learn more about and dig into further, but really interesting that Whistler was involved. This started his collaboration with Cochrane, and he'd actually wound up working on a number of other non-Coward shows with Cochrane as a designer. Another artist of the time that came into Noel's orbit was William Nicholson, the painter, who was also very well known as a stage designer. In fact, he designed the premiere production of Peter Pan, which Noel would eventually wind up appearing in as a boy actor in earlier days. But he also, in the Cochrane review, On With the Dance, he had designed a ballet by the superstar from the Ballet Russe, Landon Messine, who is now working independently as a choreographer, and had really come into Coward and Cochrane's orbit. And Coward's play, The Marquise, which was set in 18th century France. Again, not a place that we usually associate with Coward. But Nicholson became the designer of both the sets and costumes, and very, very sensitive. These, the artists were really picking up on what Coward was doing in his plays, which was realizing how unusual and fresh a voice he was. Even though this play was set in 18th century France, it was really a modern comedy, and Noel said as much. It was really about, he loved the visual aspect of what it was, but it was really transposing a very modern sensibility into that time frame. And Nicholson immediately picked up on that, and so used these colors that would be associated much more with a contemporary palette in these costumes, and also in his design of the set, which was this very contemporary looking octagonal room that was painted in a very kind of wonderful red color that was considered very daring for the time. So he gave it this constant modern overlay or underlay to what was happening on stage. He was very much in tune with what Coward was doing. And there were also artists who were associated in Cochrane's orbit that were not connected necessarily with the shows themselves. This is the artist Gluck. I was very pleased to learn about in the course of working on this show. She was an heiress with the Lyons Tea Rooms empire in the US, and her uncle Montague ran the Trocadero Grill and had invited Cochrane to stage a cabaret. Ongoing cabaret in the space, which was a huge success and became a feeder for his stage shows. And she got a backstage pass basically to all this and was absolutely fascinated with it. And she wound up doing a number of canvases, backstage, front of house of this review, On With the Dance. Many of these are in private collections now, and they're very difficult to access, but we were very happy to get this original painting. This is of the actor Ernest Thessager in On With the Dance. And it also features her patented Gluck frame. She was very much connected to interior design, especially the designer Siri Mom, who would work on a number of Coward's houses. And she invented this frame, Gluck, that could be painted the wall of the color of the wall that it was on. So it would look like the painting was very organically emerging from the decor and the architecture. And this has its original Gluck frame, so we very carefully painted the wall behind it to match. So you get that effect when you see this face-to-face in the gallery. And Gluck herself was a fascinating figure, and we find more and more of this kind of hidden history of LGBTQ artists at the time. She, as a teenager, started adopting masculine clothing. She was very open about her lifelong relationships with women and also represented it in her art, and adapted her name. She was born Hannah Gluckstein, but she said, no, it's Gluck, no prefix, no suffix, no quotes. She was very, much in the forefront of her day, but this was very much part of the circle that Coward was a part of at the time. And it was fascinating to get this perspective on his work. Another thing that emerged from these visuals, one of many untold stories that emerged in all this, was the support throughout his career that Coward had given to Black artists, which again, I don't think is an association that many people are aware of today. But the gentleman in the magazine article on the left is Buddy Bradley, who was an absolutely brilliant choreographer in New York. And he was often saving the work of white choreographers, but never getting credited. And Cochran, both Coward and Cochran used to frequent, whenever they visited New York, the jazz clubs of Harlem, because most of these artists couldn't appear on Broadway theater of the time because of segregation and racism, but were blown away by the talent that they saw. And Cochran brought over a revue to London called Blackbirds that was an all-Black cast that was a smash hit. And these artists got respect, they got recognition, and many of them wound up staying on in London and having their careers there. And that was certainly true of Buddy Bradley. He opened a school of stage dancing, which taught generations of theatrical dancers in the UK. He became Cochran's a part of his regular creative team as choreographer, finally getting credit. And his first major credit was on Noel's review, Words and Music. And he really started getting finally the recognition he deserved. Likewise, the two gentlemen on the right, this is from one of the final scenes of Coward's show Cavalcade. Jack London had won medals for England in the Olympics, but an injury sidelined his career. He was also a very talented jazz pianist, and so they put him on stage as part of this scene of great modernity of the contemporary age in one of the last scenes in Cavalcade. And Leslie Thompson, the trumpeter, was one of the great jazz trumpeters of the time, would later play with Duke Ellington and Count Basie, was also a regular featured player in Cochran's pit orchestras, and they put him front and center on stage in Cavalcade as well. And this is a story that I found throughout Noel's career in many, many ways. He was incredibly supportive of Black artists, very unusual at the time, and not something that I think a lot of people would recognize today. But you see the importance of London throughout his work, not just with London Calling, but his great anthem of World War II, London Pride, even a ballet score that he wrote in the late 50s for the London Festival Ballet called London Morning. And the city just gave him enormous energy. He really seemed to, especially in the reviews, you can feel it with him and his designers trying to capture the magic of the city of London. This is the finale from this Year of Grace, and it's kind of a meta-theatrical moment. The chorus is singing about the fact that, just like the audience, they're all going to be pouring out of the theater in a minute, and we'll all be stuck in the same Piccadilly traffic jam, which this is representing. So it's a wonderful breaking of the fourth wall and bringing the evening to a close. But you also see how they could pull off these almost Busby Berkeley-esque spectacular numbers on the tiny stage of the London Pavilion. It was, talk about theatrical magic. They were certainly capable of it. And likewise, another kind of scenic world that we wouldn't associate with Coward today is his incredible spectacle Cavalcade, which covered 30 years of British history, featured a cast and crew of some 400 people, had 22 major set changes, an incredible, incredible spectacle on the huge stage of the Drury Lane. And it really set the template for every upstairs, downstairs story since. It parallels the lives of this upper crust and working class family over 30 years. Which we see represented all the way through today in things like Downton Abbey. Every one of those kinds of shows owes a debt to Cavalcade. It was really Coward who began that template. But his staging was so spectacular that when Fox Film bought the movie rights, they dispatched a film crew to film the entire stage production in London. And it became their Bible when they were producing the film in Hollywood. And it was transferred so spectacularly, often with many of Coward's stagings pretty much intact on screen. It was a huge success. It became the highest grossing film of the year, won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. He had an enormous effect, especially as someone who could write music and dialogue, on the movies of that time. And cinema likewise had a great effect on him. So much of the staging of Cavalcade had a very cinematic feel, and it in turn got readapted for the movies. There was this very symbiotic relationship with cinema that he had all his life. This next section really focuses on the incredible artists who helped Coward create these illusions on stage. And here's a little taste of that section, which focuses on this extraordinary woman, Gladys Catherine. She was not only a very dear, lifelong friend of Noel's, but she became his designer of choice for 25 years. She had no previous training as a designer. She was a painter, like so many of these artists who work with him. They were visual artists first who came into stage design. But from their very first collaboration on his play, The Vortex, which was his major breakthrough as both a dramatist and a performer, her sets and costumes garnered immediate attention, and she was on the map. And she was as much at home designing a spectacle like Cavalcade that concluded with this very up-to-the-minute contemporary scene set in the then present day, as she was with an uber romantic operetta of Noel's, like Bittersweet, which also covered many years of a woman's life through many different eras. And that's one of her original costume designs. And then you can see that very costume center stage in the hand-tinted photo on the right. I hope you're getting a sense now of how incredibly varied Coward's career was. And these shows were happening. He was incredibly prolific. And because these shows were so successful, they were often running simultaneously. At one point in the 20s, he had 4 shows on in the West End at the same time. And these could be anything from a trenchant drama like The Vortex to a light comedy like Hay Fever, an uber romantic operetta like Bittersweet, a spectacle like Cavalcade. People saw him as a chameleon. He wasn't nearly as pigeonholed as he is today in that kind of realm of light comedy. And this led to his nickname of the Master, because he really seemed to come from every angle. He had a mastery of what was going on in the theatrical world. It was incredibly varied, and something that we really hope to cast a spotlight in this exhibition. This is a drop curtain that Gladys designed for Noel's musical Conversation piece, which was set in 1811 Brighton. And because there were so many set changes, there would often be scenes performed in front of this big drop curtain. And this was considered one of her great achievements as a designer, this show, Conversation piece, which was a hit in both London and New York. And her Regency period designs made such an impact. She was as much a star as the actors on stage with these shows. There was really a neo-Regency revival in fashion and in home decor as a result of this show and these beautiful designs that she'd done. She also, because she was such a close friend of Coward, she often played a role in the decor of his houses. And she was so familiar with his offstage world that when he wrote his semi-autobiographical comedy Present Laughter, which was at least in part based on his own life, she very cleverly and sometimes in some very sarcastic ways occasionally adapted elements of his own home decor to be Gary Essendine's home on stage. And this is an example of it. She took many different elements from homes that she had helped to decorate herself and put them on stage to identify with Coward. And when Coward had a very successful run of films that he had full control over in the 1940s, she was there too, designing them. Everything from the gritty wartime epic In Which We Serve, which won a Special Academy Award, to one of the crown jewels of British cinema, Brief Encounter. She had a mastery, and to the Technicolor splendor of Blithe Spirit, which we'll see a little bit later on. She had a complete kind of visual mastery in the same way that Noel did of the verbal side. And the combination of the two of these talents was really extraordinary and a pivotal point in Noel's career. And he was incredibly supportive of women at this time. This is another thing that's been revealed in working on this exhibition. This is a self-portrait by Doris Zenkaisen, one of the great set and costume designers of the time. Started working with Noel very early on in some of the Cochrane reviews, did great work with him there. This costume design is for the film version of Bittersweet, which starred Anna Neagle, who had come out of the Cochrane chorus line and was by this point a major star in British film. This was the first film version of Noel's Bittersweet, which she also designed. And you can see from these two images that she was very forthright about women's bodies and sexuality. And she felt, this was a groundbreaking period in the 20s of women's asserting their freedom and independence and strength. And she felt she felt like it was very important to feature women's bodies in a very open and bold way. And so some of the costumes she designed were very revealing, so much so that they would sometimes cause a rebellion of the chorus line. And in one of Cochrane's shows, she actually had to redesign them because they felt they were too revealing. But she was very forthright, and she really put this power of women centrally on stage. And she worked with Noel sporadically over 30 years of his career, including in the 1950s in his musical After the Ball, which was a musical adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan. And she went the opposite direction of really encasing her characters completely in these Victorian fashions of the time, which are really about, holding them stiff when they have all these roiling emotions of lust and betrayal and bitterness against each other that are the grounding of this comedy. She used this kind of concealment in the costumes to actually be very revealing in its own way. She was very much in tune with what Coward was trying to do, and really created some beautiful costumes and sets for that production. This is Edward Molyneux, the great couturier, and he had a very, very special place in Coward's career, and as I said, wound up dressing a lot of his leading ladies after they first worked together on London Calling. This is a dress he designed for the first production of Present Laughter, for Judy Campbell. And you can see what he was known for was this incredible simplicity. It was almost like a Grecian simplicity of design, but the absolutely masterful cut and sense of materials, and a real sense of understatement, which was what Noel valued tremendously. It was what his comedy was based on, but it was also a fundamental Englishness in the look. And it was no accident that he wound up working mostly with British designers throughout his career. They really understood the world that he was creating that was special and particular, that foreign designers would not have served as well or understood as well. Molyneux certainly did. This is one of the things that we're most pleased with in the exhibition. We wanted to do for years a reconstruction of this beautiful white satin dress that Molyneux created for Gertrude Lawrence in Private Lives. And finally, we're able to realize with this show. It's one of the seminal designs in Noel's work. It was part of his original inspiration for the play, imagining Gertrude Lawrence in a white Molyneux dress just like this. And it became a fashion icon. It appeared in Vogue just a few weeks after the show opened in London and really set the style for an era. And so pleased to be able to offer this very meticulous reconstruction of this dress in the exhibition. And Molyneux continued for many years. He had suffered a very bad, nearly been blinded in an injury in World War I, and this wound up dogging his career and finally led to his retirement. But worked with Noel and would continue to do special projects with him. But his last major project with him was designing the film version of The Astonished Heart, a one-act play of Cowards. Not a very successful film. He wasn't working with his great team of the 1940s, but the Molyneux costumes are exceptional in the film for Margaret Leighton. It became a big selling point for the film. Another great who worked on a Coward show was Norman Hartnell. And was known eventually as the Queen's dressmaker, one of the great British designers of the period. But he got a rocky start with Noel initially. He, like every British designer, they all wanted to be featured in Cochrane reviews. It was like getting your dress worn on the red carpet by a megastar today. And had a very rocky beginning with Coward on his shows, and had some costumes rejected initially, but finally was able to break through. He was a little too fancy, I think, for Coward. I think he was much more about more is more and decoration. And he had done the costumes for an early debacle play of Noel Coward's called Sirocco, which also didn't set him in good stead. But he finally wound up collaborating on Tonight at 8:30, this cycle of 9 one-act plays that Coward acted in with Gertrude Lawrence that were stunning and were a huge hit and became some of the iconic costumes in Coward's work. Another great was Cecil Beaton, who originally started out extremely jealous of Noel. He really wanted to be in the theater. He was a frustrated playwright and was very frustrated by Noel's success, despite his own enormous fame as a fashion photographer, but was eventually able to parlay that into work in the theater as a designer. And here he photographed Noel's, the second production of Blithe's Spirit, and eventually wound up working with him on his play Quadrille that starred his great friends Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontanne, this Victorian comedy that they did in the 1950s. And he really became a great ally eventually to Coward. They became fairly close, although it would always be a bit of a spiky relationship. And this is a later French farce that he designed. Coward did an adaptation of a Feydeau farce called Look After Lulu. And this is Beaton's wonderful set design, which in a way seems to parody his Belle Epoque sets for Gigi, for which he just won an Academy Award just around that time. You could see he goes for this almost psychedelic palette, which in many ways was also harkening back to the ballet roots. He was a huge fan of the designs of the ballet roots, particularly Leon Bach's. and this became his own reincarnation of that look. Design for Living looks at Noel's offstage life. We've been talking about the different ways that these sections are orchestrated. He was such a master at working on and devising his offstage image as masterfully as he was on. And was an incredible fashion trendsetter even when he wasn't trying to be. He started the great fashion for colorful turtleneck jumpers in the 20s, particularly worn with a blazer, a look that continues to this day. He popularized the Nehru jacket in the 1950s, but of course in the silk dressing gowns. He wound up having a huge effect on fashion, but very, very conscious of his image off stage as well. That photo on the left in the sketch was from the very beginning of his career when he burst like a bombshell in the vortex, where his fame really started. But it was a very created image. You'd think that was a fashionable Mayfair flat, and it's actually his room in his mother's boarding house in Ebury Street, which he continued to live in for a number of years after his fame, but gussied up with great sense of style. But this was before he acquired his wonderful later homes. And as he transformed, he kept his look going. It was photographed by some of the great photographers of his day. This was a great photograph by Horst, photographer of the time, where he, has this sheen of great success, wearing his Savile Row suit. He always was very conscious of this public presentation. This is a great friend of his, Clemence Dane. That was her pseudonym. Winifred Ashton, his great friend, who was a wonderfully successful writer at the time, and also accomplished artist who taught him a lot about painting and sculpture. We have on display a copy of the bust she did of him, and another one of which is in the National Portrait Gallery as a painting of hers of Noel. And she really taught him a lot, as well as had an influence on his writing. Oh, I'm going backwards. Not the direction we wanted. There we go. But he also, he was very carefully navigating his private identity as a gay man. This is a time when homosexuality was criminalized in Britain. He grew up in the shadow of Oscar Wilde's Fall from Grace. And it would remain a criminal offense for most of his life and career. And so there were real dangers in coming out at the time. He also had an image as a straight leading man, which he had to preserve. But he did really present this alternative version of masculinity that had a huge effect on the style of his time. And many people, regardless of their identity and on the gender spectrum, really identify with him at the time. It became a different kind of a look and a different kind of a style that was embraced. But although he was discreet, he maintained his relationships in pretty plain sight in his life. It's pretty amazing to look back on things that were written and published at the time, where his relationships in many ways seem to be treated very matter-of-factly and openly. And these are the two great loves of his life. That's on the left is Jack Wilson, who was his first really serious relationship. They wound up being business partners and producing partners for most of Noel's life, even after their romantic relationship faded. That's a portrait by Oliver Messel. And on the right is Graham Payne, who became the great later love of his life, and it became a lifelong partnership. A very talented performer who Noel tried to put in his own role as a surrogate leading man, not to the greatest effect, but really tried to support Graham's work as an actor. And then following Noel's death and that of Cole Leslie, his very dedicated personal affairs manager, Payne became the manager of his estate. And it's really to him that we owe the Coward Archive, from which many wonderful items in this exhibition come. We owe a great debt to his wonderful management of Coward's properties and the objects from his estate. A side of Noel that's very little known is his presidency of the Actors Orphanage, which he was president of for 22 years, very actively involved in taking care of these children and giving them a great home and schoolroom and a really great start to their lives. Many of these children were not orphans. They were the product of theatrical liaisons where their parents couldn't or wouldn't be able to support them. And it started off with a great social stigma that Noel was really able to reverse. He held these incredibly successful celebrity events. These are the theatrical garden parties that he did in the 30s and 40s, where he attracted every member of the theatrical community who were dressed to the nines. They looked like they're in the royal enclosure at Ascot. And this is his own gray topper and white kid gloves that are featured in that photo. on the left, and really set a image of style, but also the intermingling of theatrical royalty with actual royalty. That's him with the Duchess of Kent, who was one of his great patrons. He did eventually get knighted, and it's always been a bit of a mystery why it took so long. It was in 1970, which was very close to the end of his life. And people wondered, there's a lot of speculation of what the real reasons are, a lot of both official explanations and unofficial ones for why it didn't happen. But in any case, he was eventually knighted in 1970, and we have his original insignia badge, his Knight Bachelor insignia badge on display. It was a very important moment for him that he attended with his great friends, Gladys Catherine and the actor Joyce Carey, members of his adopted family. Noel was very astute at adapting his image over time. This is his dressing gown that became world famous when he appeared in Las Vegas. His reputation had really been slipping in the late 40s and 50s, many people feeling that he was out of date. But he started this brilliant cabaret act that he first did at the Café de Paris in London. But his real reinvention happened in Las Vegas. And he was taken, pictures of him were taken in this dressing gown that were beamed all over the world with guests like Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland. And we have this original gown in the exhibition. It was really updating his look into something that was appropriate to the 1950s, appropriate to Las Vegas, but very, very canny reinvention of his whole career that happened. And this is an iconic photo that also came out of it, showing him out in the Nevada desert, looking like $1 million, really coming roaring back, the quintessential Englishman in tropical climes photo, but reinvented for the 1950s. And it really gave a huge boost and new life to his career. And it led to, among other things, some of his wonderful later film roles, cameos in films that people remember him from, everything from Our Man in Havana to The Italian Job. And we have this original wonderful suit that was made by the great tailor, Savile Row tailor, Douglas Hayward for Coward. This chocolate brown color, which was very adventurous in the 1960s, but otherwise is fairly, traditional tailoring. And we have all the original accoutrements of this suit, from the suede shoes to the Turnbull and Asser shirt. So you really get a picture of Noel in later life. He loved the suit so much that it became his offstage uniform as well for many of his public appearances. His homes were also a source of great interest to people. He had a country home in Kent for many years. He had a wonderful Tony apartment in London on Gerald Road in Belgravia. And he really had a very acute style sense. And this became, of course, because of his celebrity, became international news. People were very interested in how he lived. And he had this a style that we really recognize as very much a part of our own time, a mix of the contemporary and the traditional. And he often employed the designer Siri Mom, who was famous for her white-on-white interiors. And this is a section of the exhibition we were really pleased to be able to receive more recently some items from Noel's home his final home in Switzerland, Chalet-Coward, including those iconic Wings of Time, 17th century artifact he'd acquired in the 20s, which traveled with him to all his homes, that famous Hamlet chair that he was often seen posed in. And I think you can get a real sense of his decorating sense, the mix of the contemporary and the traditional. Even down to his personal accoutrements. He was almost never without a cigarette on stage or off, so we have some of his indelible and original smoking accoutrements, including a cigarette holder and the sailor hat he used as an ashtray. He had a lovely, small but distinguished art collection that included people like Vlaminck and Bonnard and Christopher Wood, the British painter who he was very fond of, who he'd known, and who tragically committed suicide at age 29. He was particularly fond of this painting, The Blue Boat, which he kept all his life, and was a source, I think, of great inspiration to some of his own painting, Wood's kind of naive style. He referred to his painting style as touch and Gauguin, but he was really very serious about it. He was an amateur. This was never done for professional reasons. It was just a source of great relaxation and joy. He would give them to friends, have them auctioned off for charity. But he started off painting a lot. He very rarely painted a theatrical subject. He much more focused on the landscape around his homes, the English countryside. And it's fascinating to see how his palette changes as he travels, and he really explodes when he goes to Jamaica with these tropical canvas and colors, the sea, the sky. it really transforms his work. And we have a number of examples of his work on display in the show. Really, really fascinating side of his character, and continuing, you know, in a direct line to those little drawings he made in his notebooks as a boy, really trying to capture the world around him. It's an important part of his life and work. And the theme also of supporting Black artists. He cared very much about his nearby neighbors in Jamaica, who often were subject to incredible poverty, and there were few opportunities for people to thrive. So he marshaled some of his friends, and they started a shop that they supported for local artisans to treat them, to show off their wares, to train them in business. It was so successful that the alumni of this group opened their own rival shops and put this shop, which he called Designs for Living, out of business, which of course completely pleased Coward. That was exactly what he was hoping for. That painted plate was one he contributed his own work to help raise funds for this shop, and that plate is part of it. One of the things on display. And the final section of the exhibition, Marvelous Party, looks at Noel's ongoing influence today, the way he's still having a tremendous impact on the world of style and fashion, not to mention theater and film. The 2020 film version of Blithe Spirit featured amazing costumes that we have two of them on display in the exhibition, including this beautiful Madame Arcadi costume that was worn by Judi Dench, very much inspired by his period. But also Noel in himself is a great figure of inspiration. He has hotel suites and lounges everywhere from the Savoy in London to the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Bangkok that are named for him and that honor his legacy. He was a huge fan of fragrance and perfume, many of which are mentioned in his work, used very insightfully to describe character. He loved it offstage too. Many of them have become classics that endure to this day. And so those are given some space in this section. And even one of his paintings was recently used for a brand new edition of Elizabeth Bowen's novel as the cover painting, a beautiful painting of Portofino he did in the 50s. But his real impact that you can also see, aside from his impact, obviously, on theater and film, is also on fashion. And these beautiful hand-dyed dressing gowns and smoking jackets by the designer Georgina von Etzdorf was very much inspired by Coward's World. They're represented in the show. And the American designer Anna Sui, her whole autumn-winter 2017 collection was very much inspired. She loved the original 1945 film version of Blithe Spirit. And she created this green iridescent fabric that reminded her very much of the ghostly effects of that film. But really, this whole collection was really inspired by that kind of Technicolor sheen and by the very strong creative women who surrounded Noel. It was very much inspiring. And the final room of the exhibition is the media gallery, where you get to see Noel on film, some very rare original production footage, some pictures of his homes from Jamaica to Switzerland, and features these final costumes that we hope kind of wraps up the experience. And something I was very pleased to add to this version of the exhibition, we had discovered some original stereoscopic slides, personal photos that Noel had taken in the 30s. He had a stereoscopic camera. And we finally were able to get these fully restored with their brilliant original color and in 3D that you can experience in the viewer in the gallery. Really wonderful sense of Noel's offstage world. So that wraps it up for this talk. I know I've gone a little bit over time, but I just wanted to share with you, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what's in the exhibition. There are over 300 items in the show, many, many more stories than I've been able to share with you. But I think Maria now wants to set us up for questions. We'll hopefully have a little time for that. But I very much hope you'll get to see the show. It runs through December 23rd. It's free. Right now, because of the COVID restrictions, they're asking people to book. So just go on their website and book online. But hopefully we'll get to a point in this run where we don't need to have those restrictions. But the Guildhall has been exemplary in putting every kind of safety precaution in place. So you can feel very secure in going to see the show, which I hope you will.
Brad, thank you. I've just taken you out of screen share so we can actually see you for a bit better now. That was fascinating, and it's really remarkable how much depth there is in Noel Coward, for those who are maybe just more familiar with some of those wonderful songs. Indeed. But to see how he worked with the different artists. How was he to work with, actually? Did people like working with him?
He was he was a very hardcore professional. And, as long as people came fully engaged to the task and did their job, he was great to work with, and many actors have spoken about, in particular, how wonderful and supportive he could be. If you were doing your job, if you didn't know his lines, that was the cardinal rule. You had to come in knowing your lines verbatim. You didn't change a comma. But he was very supportive of actors and would really try and feature them at their best, but also had great relationships with his designers. He really knew how much they were contributing to his shows and had very, very rich kind of engagement with them. And people loved working on his shows because they were, they almost all were tremendous hits in their days, so people's work would be seen. But they also realized that what he was doing was very new. So much of what he was addressing, even in these light comedies, was very daring in terms of sexual adventurousness, in terms of social commentary. He seemed to be part of that world, that upper crust world, but he was very much an outsider. And he had that perspective. And people realized that he was doing something very fresh on stage. And designers responded to that, as I was indicating, and really enjoyed working with him. And he, of course, appreciated their work tremendously.
Interesting. And speaking of working with people, what was it like, and how did you and the curatorial team at the Guildhall Art Gallery, how did you manage this?
It's been quite the year and a half, I can tell you. We had been working on the show for about a year and a half before the pandemic hit, and I had made multiple visits to London, thank goodness, and so really, really knew the space. We were very far along in the planning. As I say, when things really shut down in March, the show was supposed to open in July of last year. So we were very far along in the preparation and planning, thank goodness. And I could not have done this without an incredible team on the ground in London, both on the Coward Foundation and Archive Trust side, and the crew at the Guildhall have just been phenomenal. But thank goodness for Zoom, and thank goodness for WhatsApp and chats, and we've been able somehow, with me 5,000 miles away, have been able to make this happen. But it's been an almost daily, conversation and communication. But thank goodness, having people I could really rely on and trust there, who really knew what we were after. And we were fairly far along in the conception and the details of the show. But the problems have been unbelievable. There are so many things that could have derailed this show. So many lenders whose buildings were completely sealed off, their staffs furloughed, even down to being able to obtain research materials. So many libraries and archives have been shut down. So many things that I would have had easy access to before have been impossible. Just getting mannequins for this show turned into a BBC miniseries drama all by itself, getting these costumes mounted. But thankfully, the wonderful crew in London has persevered, and it's kind of a miracle that the show is on, but very pleased with where we ended up.
Good. I know a lot of us are very keen to get there soon and be able to see it. As you said, it's up until the 23rd, I think, of December.
Right.
So we have got no excuse and look forward to it. But really, Brad, thank you very much for giving us such an interesting talk this evening. And
it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
As I had mentioned earlier, this is the first event in our new summer program. So to find out more about the upcoming talks and next week's virtual walk, please do go to our website, which is www.artscapades.org. And remember, if you haven't already, to sign up to our mailing list. Incidentally, one of the talks that will be coming up in our new series is on the Constance Spry exhibition, which is at the Garden Museum. And it's quite interesting, Brad, to have heard you talking about Gluck and her connection with Noel Coward, because she, of course, had a connection to Constance Spry as well, and painted some of her wonderful flower arrangements too.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that talk because her name came up frequently in my research.
But no, thank you, Brad, and to everyone tonight for watching us and for helping us to support the arts. And goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.